Snow fell the way it always had in the gods would, quiet as ash, quick as breath. Jon stood beside the black pool beneath the heart tree and let the chill bite him. Ghost made no sound as he paced the margin where trampled paths vanished into the drift. The red leaves shivered when the wind came up from the north, and the carved face looked down as if measuring a man for some garment only the cold could weave. He had sent word to the lords. He had sent word to the south. The raven Davos had told him to expect should arrive by noon or not at all, and it was noon now by the slant of light that made crystal of every needle on the pines and did nothing to warm the day. "We've both worn too many names," he told the tree, and that was the sort of thing he would never have said to any living soul. Best to choose the one that lets others sleep easy. Ghost sniffed at the air and pointed his great head toward the gatehouse. Jon felt it then. The drumbeat of hooves, the ring of iron over ice. He left the pool and the cold red gaze of the face, and by the time he came into the yard, the riders were clattering in. Davos Seaworth led them, one gloved hand raised in greeting, Snow stippling his eyebrows and beard as though winter had chosen to knight him in its own fashion. Davos swung down stiffly. "Your Grace," he said, "I've brought a south wind and a man with answers." The south wind was stamped and steaming in the form of horses. The man with answers was inside Davos's cloak, which he opened enough to show the oilskin tube that meant letters. Jon thought of all the letters that had found him and all that had been too late. "Come," Jon said. "We'll have you by the fire before your fingers fall off, old friend." The hall smelled of oak smoke and meat and men. Sansa had ordered rushes changed this morning, and their faint sweetness rose beneath the heavier scents. She sat upon the high seat with a ledger in her lap, hair pinned bluntly to keep it from the flames. When she saw Davos, her mouth softened and then tightened, as if a smile had been an arrow she had almost let fly. "Ser Davos," she said, "welcome to Winterfell. Did the sea try to claim you out there?" "It nipped at my heels, my lady," Davos said, "but I've had worse bites." Jon took the tube and loosed its bindings. The first letter bore the Stag of Storm's End, a newly painted device that looked too fresh to be old and too earnest to be false. The words inside were careful, each line like a man placing a cup on a table too fragile for the weight. Gendry Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End by the decree of Daenerys Stormborn, by the consent of the Stormlands lords gathered after the wars, answered the summons of the king in the north with plain gratitude and a promise to come in person before the moon turned. Jon read it aloud for the sake of the hall and because the words sat oddly in his mouth, as if they were heavier when you shared them. Sansa sat very still, and when he finished, she closed her ledger softly and looked from Jon to Davos and back again. She had learned that stillness. It made men give more away. "You trust him," she said to Davos.
"I do," Davos replied.
"He knows steel, your grace. He knows hunger. And he knows little of the rest, which is rarer than you'd think in a lord." Davos's other letters were from lesser houses. Karstark and Manderley and Glover, Swan and Tarth from the south. A tidy roll from House Penrose with a sand-scuffed seal. All answers. All coming. The hall buzzed like a hive in winter, slow and intent. That night, when the candles guttered and the hearth died down to a long red eye, Jon and Sansa walked the covered bridge between the bedchambers and the library tower, breath making ghosts between them. "You mean to do it," she said, "to name him your heir." Jon's breath showed his hesitation in little puffs. "I mean to spare the North another war it can't afford," he said. "Our granaries are half full when they should be bursting. The holdfast's lost men we cannot replace for 2 harvests. If I die, the lords will look at one another and start counting debts and knives. The Stormlands are as hungry as we are. Hunger is quiet until it is not. And the lords." Sansa's eyes were river water in winter, a gray you had to learn to read. "You think the Glovers and the Manderleys and the Serwyns will send up cheers for a Baratheon to keep their winters? I think they will listen if I ask them to," Jon said. "I think they will if you ask them to." "What am I then in this plan?" Sansa's mouth tilted, bitter and wry. "The sister who nods, the lady who smooths the linen after the decision is already made? The one whose word tips the scale," Jon said. You know how to count knives too, Sansa, and you know where not to cut. If he proves himself, if the Stormlands bind themselves to us by law and oath, the North gains a shield to the south and a partner who owes nothing to kings in any city we don't answer to. You speak as though there is no king in any city, Jon. He looked away. Let Bran have the river and the rock and the gold. He has no need of snow. Sansa heard what he hadn't said. You've heard no more from King's Landing, she said. And in her voice there was no malice and no comfort, only understanding. The Great Council is a thing that can speak for a day and be silent for a year. They will count ships and coin and forget we lost half the world to save the rest. Very well. If this can hold our people, I will speak for it. He nodded, and for a few steps they walked in the easy, heavy quiet of kin. At the arch where the night would have swallowed them out of sight, she touched his sleeve. Jon, she said, are you so sure you mean to die childless? He had no answer that didn't cut. He looked at her hand on his sleeve and thought of all the hands he'd held and let fall. I mean to choose with the life I've had, not the one I don't expect, he said. Felt like truth in his mouth, and so perhaps it was. Gendry came with a storm the next week. The ravens had been right. Snow above the neck, rain below it. Winterfell's ramparts shed wet snow, and the roads became glass. Even so, the Stormlander riders pressed through by ones and twos, dripping and grinning the way men do when they have beaten weather enough to hold their heads higher. Gendry rode at the head, not because he knew how to do the pretty things lords did with their teams and banners, but because the men behind him would not have let him ride anywhere else. He had the sort of look that made you decide whether or not you liked him before he'd spoken. Big in the shoulders, hair like a crow's wing, eyes the blue of the sea seen through rain. He swung down and remembered to bow, though it took him a half-beat too long to decide how low was enough for a king of the North who was his friend's friend and had, once, been a black-cloaked brother. When he straightened, his grin was there before he could stamp it out. It made his face younger and more dangerous at once. Your Grace, Gendry said, you sent for me. I brought myself and half the Stormlands. The other half are trying to dry their boots by their own fires and say they'll come when their fingers thaw. Lord Gendry, Jon said, welcome to Winterfell. This is my sister, Lady Sansa Stark. Gendry bowed again, more steadily this time, and Sansa, who had learned to measure men by what their eyes did when they were made to look down, liked that his did not. He did not stare at her as men had done in the South, and he did not glance away nervously like boys at harvest dances in the North. He saw her and waited to see what she would make of him, which was a rare skill. Lord of Storm's End, she said, we were children when our fathers were friends. It seems a long road to walk to keep a promise between them. My lord father knew how to drink and swing a hammer, Gendry said, surprising her. And he had a way of making friends he did not deserve. I doubt he planned for me to help his promises along. He made a small, self-mocking shrug. I can help with the hammering, at least. Ghost moved like a white shadow around him. Gendry held his ground, which is also a thing to like in a man. The first supper was loud enough to warm the stones. The Southlanders tried their hands at the northern toasts and failed with good humor. The Northmen watched them with the patient curiosity of men at a dogfight who could not decide whether it would end in bites or sniffs. Alice Karstark, hair as pale as new hay, asked Gendry if the stories of the Hound were true. Gendry said the truest ones were the weirdest and told a tale about a barmaid, a hogshead, and a signpost that made even Davos hide his mouth in his cup. After, when the hall had emptied to drunks singing and servants scolding and the last scraping of trenchers, Brienne of Tarth came forward and went to one knee before Sansa's seat. Sansa had known she was there. No one missed Brienne in a crowd, but had waited. The sight of Storm's End's overt marshals in Winterfell wore strangely, but there was a rightness in the awkward bow that soothed something old in Sansa's chest. My lady, Brienne said, you sent for me. I am yours. I never stopped counting you among mine, Sansa said, and then to Gendry. And I never forgot you were a daughter of the Stormlands. House Tarth is old, Brienne said. Older than the Durandons, some reckon. Older than the walls that keep out the sea. Older than the kings who tried to rule every wave. My father sends his seal with mine to say Lord Gendry holds the marches by our word, as well as any parchment a dragon queen pressed with hers. Your father said that? Gendry asked, astonished, and then recovered. I mean, thank you, Lady Brienne. He is not a man for words, Brienne said. He prefers the tide and the horses, but he knows a man who builds and keeps, and says it is time the Stormlands had more builders and fewer ruiners. Davos, watching, hid his grin in his hand. I told you, he murmured to Jon. They will come in ones and twos and say the same thing in a dozen tongues, and it will add to the same end. They want someone who does not forget what winter feels like. When the council met in the solar the next day, the room was cold enough to make breath bloom. Jon stood at the long table that had held as many maps as flagons in its day. The lords gathered by station and instinct. Manderly with his scribes, Glover with his stiff jaw, Serwyn and Lady Alice Karstark with the keen look of young leaders who had inherited scars not their own. From the south, Lord Swan, slender and grave, Ser Roland Storm of Nightsong, who had thrown his bastard-born name on the table of lords as a piece worth owning. Representatives of House Grandison and House Estermont, and two austere Tarths whose manner said they listened more than they spoke. Davos leaned at Jon's left hand like a pillar that had learned to walk. The iron crown the northern smiths had made for Jon lay on the table, and beside it the river-smoothed bit of driftwood Gendry had worn like a talisman since he took Storm's End, the only crown he trusted, a scrap of a ship that had survived. Jon set his hands on the table. You've all bled, he said. We've all buried men and been told it wasn't enough. We've been told to feed the South with grain we don't have and men we can't spare, or be called oathbreakers by mouths that didn't taste our winter. I'm done being told. The North will keep the peace that is ours to keep. We will not feed war. The room listened as rooms do when men discover they already agree. I have no wife, Jon said. He did not say he'd had one for an hour. He did not say her name out loud because it would pull the room sideways into a memory no one else shared. I have no son. If I die, the North splits along the old seams, and men with knives open them. I will not see that done. I would name an heir who can hold the North because he knows he is not fit to own it. A man who builds more than he breaks. A man whose claim is as much to the love of those who know him as to any seal. Gendry looked poleaxed, which was close enough to honest that Jon did not hold it against him. The lords made their murmurs, and in that sound Sansa heard fear and habit and the start of curiosity. Lord Gendry, Jon said, turning to him with the steadiness he could put on like a cloak when he needed to. I would name you my heir by northern law, that if I die without issue, and if the lords here gathered consent, you would take the oaths and keep them. In return, I would ask the Stormlands to bind themselves to the North by sworn covenant, that no army marches through either land against the other, that grain and steel and harbor and road are shared as if between brother and brother, that we will not kneel to any king who seeks to make us fight his wars. Will you accept this, and will the Stormlands? Gendry's mouth opened and shut once. He was a man who found his balance with weight in his hands. Empty-handed, you could see where the space discomfited him. He looked to Davos because that was habit. Davos gave him nothing but a look that said, "You're the one holding the hammer, lad." He looked to Sansa because she had spoken to him, as if he were not a child who had found new clothes. Sansa kept her face as calm as Winter River and let him see that there was warmth under the ice if you just reached deep enough. I didn't know I'd be asked for this when I set out, Gendry said finally. But I knew I'd be asked for something. People have always come to me for things they could carry away. Sword, horseshoe, hinge. This is not different, only heavier. You want an oath you can carry to your people and set in their hearths, so it keeps the cold off. I can give that. The Stormlands will swear not to raise steel against the North or to feed any that do. We can spare ships and smiths and hands for the road that is more mud than stone from the Neck to White Harbor. He hesitated, and when he spoke again there was something raw in his voice that a more polished man would have hidden. I won't promise you silver I don't have, or justice beyond what a man can keep in his own hall. But I'll promise you to come when you call, and to ask when I don't know, and to open the door to men who speak true even if they're telling me I'm a fool. The words were not the sort that would live on a banner, but they settled the way heavy things settle. Some in relief, some in resignation, some in an old sadness that we are always making new shapes out of the same cold clay. Manderley waited to see who would speak first. Lord Robert Glover, grim as a gatepost, stood. My father bent his knee to a king with gold hair and watched his house be taken apart by courtesy, he said. I bent my knee to the son of Eddard Stark and then told him to sit while we fought his war without him, and we were made fools for it. I am done bending knees to men far from my hearth. Lord Gendry, would you keep my men in their beds till the harvest is brought? Would you keep my boys on their horses in the yard instead of bleeding under banners they've never seen? I would, Gendry said, and if you send them to me unasked, I'll send them back with their feet still in their boots. Robert grunted. Then I'll hear this oath. Lady Alice Karstark nodded, a small swift motion. House Karstark stands, she said. We are tired of our dead being called honorable. On the southern side, Lord Swan inclined his head. The Stormlands have quarrels enough at their table, he said dryly. It would be well to have a neighbor who does not knock at ours with a sword in hand. The agreements were written that afternoon, not in a single page to hang in a hall but in half a dozen copies on tough vellum, stitched with cord dyed black and blue, one for each great house and two for the road. Davos checked the words for tricks no one there would think to make, and Sansa ensured the provisions for grain and harbor were written by hands that would endure in court, wherever courts would spring up next. In the evening, under snow that came down now in fat flakes, Gendry stood in the Godswood with the northern lords gathered as witness, candles and tallow torches making little islands of light. He stared at the heart tree. I've never sworn by a tree, he said to Jon, awkward and earnest. I don't know if I should say the names. I don't want to be rude. The tree knows when to listen, Jon said, and when men mean what they say. Gendry nodded. He was dressed plainly for a lord, in fur for the cold and wool for the rest. He had left any trappings he owned in the hall. That felt right. He faced the carved face and spoke into the red leaves that made the wind sound like breath. I am Gendry of House Baratheon, Lord of Storm's End, he said. I swear by blood and iron and by this wood, if it will hear me, that the Stormlands will not raise sword against the north and will not feed those who do. We will send hands and metal and wood to roads and ships as we can spare them, and we will treat the men of the north as guests and neighbors when they come to us. I swear to come when I'm called and to ask when I don't know, and to be honest when I fail. If I break this, may my hall leak, and my bread burn, and may every nail I set draw out before I turn my back. It was a smith's oath dressed in a Southlander's plain sense, and something in the red leaves seemed to still as if listening. Sansa, standing back with Brienne, felt an old and small stirring inside that had nothing to do with faith and everything to do with hearing someone say a thing and know they would try to keep it even if it cut. Jon nodded to him then, and he laid his palm on the old trunk and spoke the names of his ancestors as the maesters had taught him long ago, the names he still held beside the ones he had learned after. Stark and Snow, Targaryen in a whisper no one would ever make him say loud. He claimed no dragons. He kept to wolves. The next morning, the hall was full because a hall likes to be part of history even when the men in it will only pass on a muddy fragment. Jon stood with the Iron Crown before him. He had already said the words to the lords in private, but the people needed to hear them the way they would tell them to their wives and their sons when they were old. The North has an heir, he said. If I die without child, Lord Gendry of Storm's End will take the oaths to keep the North and will be held to those oaths by every man and woman here. If I live and beget sons and daughters, then the gods will do as they always do and laugh at our plans. For now, this is our choice. There was muttering and a shifting of feet, and then Alice Karstark's clear voice called, "The North keeps the North," which was not a cheer but was not a challenge, and it spread like a practical prayer. It was a strange noise, but it was theirs. After, when the press thinned, Gendry found Arya in a corner by the steps that led to the wall walk, her hair tucked under a boy's cap out of habit rather than need. She had come in the night on a courser that liked to bite and had slipped into the hall the way wind slips under a door. Gendry stopped the way men do when something that had been done arrives on 2 feet to look at you. I heard, Arya said, which meant she had known before he could have told her. So you'll be king of snow when Jon's gone. That's a jest the gods would enjoy. I'll be a man doing as he's told, Gendry said. He forced his hands not to fidget. You look like yourself. And you look like a lord trying not to be, she said. She didn't soften because Arya didn't, but the truth came yes. You're when they were together. I was wrong to say no the way I did. I was always going to say no. I don't wear other people's names well. But I was wrong to make it sound like you were asking me to be smaller. You were trying to give me something that weighed what I could carry. I didn't say thank you. I didn't ask for thanks, Gendry said, then took a breath that tasted of smoke and old wood. But I'll take it. What you're doing now. Arya's mouth did that little twist it had when she was trying to find the right word in a language that didn't always have one. It's bigger than a wedding in a castle. Men will think they can pull you apart from 3 directions and wear pieces of you like charms. Don't let them. And she hesitated because she didn't say things about the heart unless she had to cut there. Sansa's better at court than anyone who'll walk through these doors. Don't think that means she hasn't got scars that ache when it rains. Talk to her like a person and not like a lady. She will decide to like you if you let her decide on her own. Gendry blinked. Sansa? You need an alliance with a face, Arya said. Words and vellum rot. Children grow. People remember weddings. You need a Stark if you're going to sit in the north when Jon's bones are in the snow. You cannot have me, but you could do worse than my sister. Gendry looked at the step between them before he looked at Arya. I don't. Your sister has had enough of men who wanted to own her. I wouldn't. Don't tell me what you wouldn't do, Arya said, but the edges of her voice were not knives. Tell her. The idea was a blade left in a table. You could walk around it. You could cut meat with it, or you could pick it up. Jon thought on it that night in the God's Wood with Ghost pressed against his knee. He did not want to trade Sansa's life like a chip on a board. He did not want to put her in any man's hall again if it would take away the ground she had found under her own feet. But Sansa was not a chip, and she was not a child, and the ground she'd made for herself was not any man's to give or take. He asked her because that was the only thing that mattered. She listened without moving. When he finished, the wind pressed her cloak against her as if the old stones had hands. It's strange, she said at last. A lifetime ago, 2 friends thought to bind their houses by a marriage. The girl it was meant for was me. The boy was not. He was a boy with hair like coal and a smile like a promise that never learned how to keep itself. She breathed, and the breath made a ghost and vanished. If you had asked me this 2 years ago, I would have said no, and I would have broken your plan to spare myself. If you ask me now, I say this, I will choose. I will not be chosen without my voice. But I will choose based on what keeps the North safe and gives our children, whoever's children they are, more winter days with bread on the table and fewer with spears at the door. That sounds like a yes wrapped in a condition, Jon said, half a smile touching him and then passing. It's a maybe wrapped in truth, Sansa said. Give me time with him. Give me space to find out if he can hear me as a person and not as a piece on his board. If he cannot, I'll not bind myself. If he can, then perhaps the gods like jokes enough to write ours in the margin. Gendry was awkward in the mornings, which Sansa liked. It made it easier to see where he braced himself and where he did not. He took a turn in the smithy without fanfare and came to the snow with his sleeves rolled to split with the way he had in Flea Bottom. He laughed with men who had no land to their names and stumbled over titles with men who had too many. He said please unselfconsciously and too many thank yous to people who were supposed to do things because they were paid to do them. He stood looking at the weirwood with the respect of a man who did not believe and did not mock others for believing. When Sansa came to him, he wiped his hands, which felt right, then looked like he thought he ought to bow, which he did, but by then she had already moved to his side, which made the movement a joke they shared. She let him see she had seen it, and he let her see he had not planned it, and so began the first thing between them. Lord Gendry, she said, Winterfell has a way of measuring men. The cold finds out what's honest. I'm not sure I like being measured, he said, then shrugged, a small lift of those heavy shoulders. But I suppose I prefer it to being assumed. We assume when we must, Sansa said. I would prefer not to. They walked along the wall walk where the snow had drifted high and been shoveled away by men with red ears and redder noses. The sky was the flat, pale gray of a trout's belly. They did not discuss the weight of their decisions for the first hour. They did not talk of heirs or titles. Sansa asked him about the first thing he had made that had not been ordered of him, which turned out to be a clasp for a girl's hair in the shape of a spring leaf, hammered out of a scrap of tin during a night when the forge-master had been drunk. He asked her what she had learned that had not been taught her, and she said how to stay alive in rooms that were meant to grind you down. That answer might have made a less brave man turn away. Gendry did not look at his feet. They talked of bread and song and snow. They looked at the world together and began to be two people instead of titles walking side by side. On the fourth day, Sansa asked him the question Arya had put into the air like a thrown knife. If we married, she said plainly, because there was power in saying plainly what others would dress in brocade and bells. What would you expect of me in Storm's End, and what would you give me in return? Gendry did not speak quickly. He did not speak slowly on purpose. He found how to seat the words so they would not topple. I'd expect you to tell me when I was wrong, he said. I'd expect you to keep my hall the way you keep this one. Doors open at the right hours, doors closed at the right hours, food on the table that tells hungry men they are seen. I'd expect you to say no to men who've been told no so rarely they've lost the feel for it. I'd expect you to teach me to read the faces I don't know yet. I'd expect you to let me say there are things you don't have to forgive in my hall, even if the world says that's how it's done. I'd give you a He scratched at his jaw, looking up at the sky as if there might be a nail to hang this on. I'd give you the freedom to go if you needed to go, and the promise I'd never lock a door between us. I'd give you a seat beside mine, not below it. I'd give you the right to say yes for Storm's End and the right to say no. I'd give you my word that I'd not ask for what you'd given enough of already. The wind rose and flattened a strand of her hair against her cheek. She let it go and didn't lift her hand to smooth it. I don't belong to the faith, she said, but I believe in oaths men can keep. When he told her about the clasp he had made as a boy, she had asked what happened to it. Sold it, he had said. A hedge knight with a sad-eyed mare needed a bit of shine for his lady and didn't have coin enough for silver. He paid me in half a loaf and I ate it hot. Best bread of my life. That night, Gendry asked the Winterfell smith for a scrap of tin and sat with his thick fingers working a thinner metal than he liked. He made a brooch in the shape of a wolf's head seen in profile, not perfect but honest, the ear a hair too big, the jaw strong. In the morning he left it on the parapet where Sansa took her tea, not with any note, and not the way boys leave things and hope to be thanked for them. He went away and split more wood than necessary so he wouldn't be there if she didn't pick it up. She picked it up. She turned it once, twice, feeling the ridges where the hammer had kissed the tin. She pinned it at her throat, and when she came to counsel with it on, Manderly's scribe looked up and back down so swiftly a wise man might have missed it. Sansa saw everything that moved in rooms like this. She saw Gendry not looking and saw the effort not to look and found it charming to be considered by a man who did not consider women pieces of furniture or prey. The engagement was not declared. It let the air ripen. The pact between Stormlands and North went into its first season of work. Stormlanders who knew the lash of a ship's rope taught Northmen who had only seen the sea paths in it. Men from White Harbor who had ridden horses only to market learned how to load a deck without breaking their backs or their toes. The road between the Neck and White Harbor ate stone like a starving thing. Gendry sent masons and iron in the form of nails and clamps, and men who had laid walls learned to lay roads, which is a different art. Davos wrote letters as if each line could make a cartwheel turn. The first barge of good southern wheat came up the Mander and Lord Wireless Manderly. He had a Wireless somewhere in him even if you couldn't point to it. Stood on the dock with his hands behind him and pretended his eyes weren't wet. The taste of old days, he said. Without the bad that came with them. There were tests. There are always tests. A band of Sellswords who had been promised payment by a Stormland lord long dead came to Stonehelm to collect by force and found the gates closed and Lord Swan on the wall beside a woman with auburn hair who said, "You may try the gate when the tide takes the pride out of your pants." A laugh went up among the men on the wall that steals a bit of courage from the men below when they hear it. The Sellswords tried anyway. Stormlander archers taught by Riverland veterans feathered them like a rainy day, and when it came to the gate, Sansa told the captain he could step inside and talk alone or turn around and drown in the rain that had begun to come down sideways. He stepped inside. She told him of the pact, of the roads, of the grain that would be lost if raiders made these routes dangerous, and of the simple arithmetic that the men with honest work had more coin than a man like him would make in a year of stealing. He blinked, and when he left, he took 6 of his men with him to the docks and signed their names to Davos's lists. In the north, a Glover cousin decided he could throw his father's grudges farther than they weighed and refused to honor the pack's grain shares when a late frost hit the Dreadfort's fields. Jon rode to him with 5 men and no banners. They had words in a yard that smelled of sheep and old bread. Jon did not threaten. He named losses. He named sons he had seen die and men whose names were now marks on walls. He named what would happen if the pact failed and men went back to raiding because they couldn't trust men to keep their word. The Glover folded before he had to be unmade. He sent the grain on. Jon rode home to a hall where the fire seemed more than a thing that ate wood. Rumors move faster than ravens sometimes. In King's Landing, where the Great Council was still an idea men talked about in rooms and in the street as if it had happened yesterday, the word came that the North and the Stormlands had bound themselves by a way that made war less easy. Some lords liked that. Some did not. A Tarly who had little to do besides hate and hunt for sport spat that the North was teaching wolves to eat off plates and called for an expedition to reclaim what has always been the king's. No one listened to him who mattered because his purse was light and his men were tired of being told their boots would be full of flowers by summer. There were whispers that this union was a dress cut cunningly for a wedding that had not yet been announced. Quiet glances followed Sansa and Gendry when they stepped into a room together. They did not hurry. They let people believe the story that helped them sleep. When the wedding was announced, because at some point a choice must be made aloud, Jon stood in the hall and felt the weight shift from him and also toward him, the way it does when you put down one heavy thing and pick up another. He watched Sansa make the choice with her chin raised at just this angle and her eyes steady, and watched Gendry receive it as if he were being given the right to carry a load and not handed a prize. Sansa said, "I will not wed a stranger," and Gendry answered, "Then I will keep from playing the stranger in my own hall." And they both understood more of the other when those words were set on the table. Brienne looked at them as if she were looking at a hearth newly lit in a house that had been cold, and Davos muttered in his sleeve, "The old king would have enjoyed this in his way," and Manderly coughed and said loudly, "We shall have to increase the ovens," which made everyone laugh and let the air out of the room. They were wed in the godswood under the red leaves, because the faith was far and, more importantly, because there is a way of doing things in Winterfell that did not require permission. Gendry spoke the old words Sansa placed in his mouth, careful and sober, and Sansa spoke them for herself as easily as if she had been born to it. Jon stood between them with Ghost at his knee, and Arya appeared at his other side without sound and said nothing but leaned one shoulder into Sansa's when the words were done in a gesture that dismissed half a life of bad weddings and made this one the only one that mattered. After, the hall was a thunder of voices and the long tables were a battlefield of meat and bread. White Harbor sent cakes in the shape of ships. Tarth sent pearls in little nets of silk. Even House Swan's gift carried with it a witty insult of their own pride. 2 ivory birds carved so perfectly that the feathers looked like they would lift if you breathed on them. The music was northern and southern both, fiddles and pipes and drums and the low thunder of men stomping in time. Gendry took Sansa's hand and forgot to be careful with the strength in it, and she squeezed back hard enough to surprise him, and the look that passed between them was the kind that grounds a hall and lifts it at the same time. It was not a storybook look. It was not a look you could sell on broadsheets. It was the look of 2 people recognizing the exact weight of the thing they had chosen and accepting it. That night, in the chamber set aside for them, where the fire made soft noise and the window admitted a square of cold starlight, Gendry went carefully and Sansa went steady. They were cautious, like men and women crossing a river on stepping stones in the dusk. They laughed when they misstepped and held each other more tightly on the next stone. There was tenderness because there had to be, and there was awkwardness because there has to be that too, and in the morning there was the comfortable soreness that says a human thing has been done without violence. Sansa lay with the blanket up to her shoulder and watched the steam from their breath touch and mingle at the window opening. Gendry watched her watch it and said, "I don't know how to do half the things men think lords know." And Sansa said, "That is why you will do the ones that matter better." And he believed her because she had not lied to him yet. Spring showed itself only in small ways in the north. The tracks of foxes melted by noon, the snow receding to reveal the skeletons of last year's nettles. In the Stormlands, the sea beat at the drum-tight skin of the world, and the cliffs held. Gendry and Sansa rode south in procession that looked smaller than its importance because they had chosen to look like travelers and not conquerors. Brienne went with them, and Davos, and a scattering of northern lords who had argued that they ought to see what a Stormlands spring felt like, if only to be able to tell it back home. The road that had been mud all their lives in the stretch between the Trident and the Marches had begun to take a shape you could trust. Men and women in shirts with rolled sleeves and brows shiny with heat stood back and let them pass and then called something after them about the price of tar or the need for more timber. And Gendry answered as if he were on foot beside them instead of on a horse with a sword at his hip. Storm's End rose out of the sea air like a hole where the wind went to get louder. Sansa had heard stories of its walls, and even stories had not given it enough. It was a kind of castle that made a person feel the difference between human craft and the earth's old bones. The courtyard took them in as if it had been waiting. On the wall, the Dondarrion banner hung faded and patched, and the Baratheon stag was newly brilliant, the paint still smelling of oil when the wind laid a tongue on it. Inside, Sansa set her hand to the stone of the keep and felt the salt that had worked into it over 1,000 years. The hall was lower than Winterfell's and wider, built like a harbor. Voices pooled in it rather than rising. Gendry stood in the center of the floor and looked upward, but he found her eyes quickly, and there was something there she had seen only on men who had spent long hours in forges. A kind of satisfaction that says the world can be held behind your ribs if you keep breathing. "We'll make a god's wood," he said, almost bashful and then steady again. "Not like yours, but a place with trees that stand, where you can hear your thoughts. And a septri where they can light their candles," Sansa answered. "Brienne's father will approve." Davos made a noise like a man who had swallowed a fishbone and then cleared it. "Look at you two dividing up the winds and calling them by their proper names. It'll do." They set the Stormlands to their work and the North to theirs in the south. A weaving house at Evenfall Hall that made thick northern warm wool on Stormland looms. A school for shipwrights in White Harbor with old men from Cape Wrath who had only ever talked to boys who spoke like riverfolk and now found themselves telling their truths to men who lived beyond real winters. They turned the pact into habit. There were storms in the making that needed no armies to be dangerous. Lord Grandison's second son, a boy with more chin than sense, took insult at a Karstark ship being given preference at the docks in Storm's End during a gale and drew steel in a way that said he expected everyone to step back to let him have his fit. Sansa's face when she heard of it went very still. Gendry went down to the docks himself. He did not shout. He put his hand around the boy's wrist and squeezed until the sword fell. He said very carefully and very low, "You can hit a man for insulting you, but you cannot pull a blade when there are crates to tie down and a ship in peril, because while the men look at you, the rope slides and then someone dies, and I cannot be the lord that let that happen for the sake of your sulk." After, Sansa took the boy into the hall and had him stand beside her as the dockmaster and 6 men, who were old enough to be his grandfather, told stories of rope that had killed men who thought they were stronger than a knot. She said to the boy, "You will eat on the dock for a month. If you draw a sword on a dock again, we will cut your belt and you will learn to hold up your own breeches with one hand while you tie with the other." The boy blushed so darkly that you could see the color even on his tanned face and said sorry in a tone that promised he might be better. In King's Landing, someone tried to make trouble by saying that this arrangement of theirs was a crown hiding in a marriage bed. Bran, who had chosen to be king of a city and a river and a mountain more than of men, sent a raven with words that were very Bran. They read like water and looked like air. They said, "The North chose its winter long ago. The Stormlands have chosen to fortify their house. So long as the roads are not broken and the ships not seized, a king has no need to lift a hand against his neighbors. Sansa read the letter twice. My brother always knew how to talk to walls, she said, and Gendry said, good, one of us should, and then kissed her because it seemed the right thing to do and because it was. Pregnancies are private marches. They belong to women and to women's bodies, and men should be careful how they walk there. Sansa knew that better than anyone. When she missed her second moon under the Storm's End rains, she told no one but her husband and her maids. And when her maids noticed, because maids always notice, she let them tell the castle in their way, the way that made bread smell better and work feel lighter. Gendry found himself moving through his days as if someone had said a song to them. He did not speak of boy or girl. He spoke of a child with hair and a name and breath in cold air. He spoke of a wolf and a stag sharing a hearth and not biting one another's haunches when no one looked. The North sent blankets in colors so deep they looked like they had been dyed with night itself. The Stormlands sent oranges and fish and a song that someone wrote to be played badly and loudly in the yard. Arya came and left quiet gifts. A small knife of very good steel with a stag on one side of the hilt and a wolf on the other, and a stuffed toy sewn by a hand that had never been asked to sew for love before and had been impatient with the thread and then tender with it in the end. Jon came to Storm's End when the sea was slate under a sky like a drawn blade. He came not with a host but with Ghost and 3 men who had learned how to walk where the wind shoved you without losing your wake. In the hall, he raised a cup to Sansa and Gendry and said, "You've done what I asked of you," and then sat with Davos by the fire and drank the way men drink when they can admit to being tired with someone who will not make them sorry for it. Bran wrote, Jon said to Davos later. He writes like a man who doesn't need anyone to understand him. That's a kind of freedom, Davos said. The kind that leaves a man lonely. You did right not to take that kind. You did right to choose a hearth kind. He watched Jon over the rim of his cup. You thinking of the wall again? It's not the wall I want, Jon said. It's the quiet. It's knowing my breath makes no one shiver but me. I'm not made to sit on chairs that rule men longer than it takes to keep them from cutting each other. He looked at the fire. When the child comes, and the pact is old enough to bow without breaking, I'll go. Tormund says there's a cave where the ice sings if you stand in it long enough. Perhaps I'll learn the song. And leave these 2 with a world you've helped build, Davos said. No shame in that. You'll have to name a date and stand behind it. People do better with dates than with the wind. He studied Jon, decided he had said enough, and changed the subject to the salted fish they had eaten on the Weeping Tower's terrace. They named the child Edric and then laughed together because of course they did. The Baratheon seed was strong. The babe's hair was black as crow. He had Sansa's mouth when he slept and Gendry's brow when he frowned, which he did with great seriousness when no one had done anything to be serious about. He howled like a winter gale when hungry and fell asleep with his fist clenched like a man who had fought a good fight and won the right to rest. Sansa held him and watched the small life breathing, the funny little bird movements babies make when they are learning their bodies, and thought of all the stories men had made of girls who must be quiet and swallow their birthdays. She smelled his head and felt the old, wordless wave of love that destroys fear for a few moments and then lets it crawl back only smaller. Brienne wept when she saw him. Not loudly, and not so anyone but Sansa noticed. Sansa took her hand and squeezed it, and Brienne nodded twice, which for Brienne was like a sob for other people. The pact had no need of a crown now. It had a child. It had the image of a world that would make sense to a boy who would grow up between the smell of sea and the bite of snow and feel neither of them as a stranger. In the markets at Duskendale and Riverrun, men said with their bread-knife logic, "A wolf stag, have you heard? They say he can already split wood with his fists." And other men said, "Nonsense, he's not yet out of pissing on himself." And then someone would laugh and set the knife down and take a drink and the room would be warmer. Jon chose his date. He stood in the Godswood at Storm's End, under trees that had been planted a year ago and did not yet know how to hold a wind, and said to Sansa and Gendry, "When the first snow stays in Winterfell's yard, I'll go with Ghost and a small guard. I'll leave the North in your hands. Not by default but by oath. Stay and be old with us if you will," Sansa said. because you had to say it, even if you meant to let a man go to find the quiet he needed. I will be old wherever I go, Jon said, which was as close as he would get to joking about the years that had been placed on him like stones in a pack. Ghost nosed his hand in the way that means move, man. Jon scratched the white fur where the ear met the skull. He went down to the sea and watched it make its endless approach and retreat over the rocks, and thought of a wall he had climbed and a girl who had laughed at him for falling, and thought of a wildling with a full heart who had taught him to laugh again when you thought you were done with it. He thought of a queen who could not be stopped in time to save herself. He thought of a boy who had not wanted any of this and had been good at parts of it anyway and had learned how to forgive himself the parts he had not. He stood there until the salt was in his hair and his lips tasted of it and the wind had braided something old and new together and called it resolve. On the morning he left, Winterfell was made of white and sound. The first snow had stuck, and men were calling to one another in the yard in voices that had learned to carry over wind. Sansa stood on the steps with Edric in her arms. Gendry stood beside her with a cloak over his shoulders and his hand remembering the weight of a hammer even when it rested empty. Arya ghosts in and out like a trick of the corner of your eye, is there when she wants to be and not when she doesn't. She was there now, tucked into the shadow of a pillar, watching but not being watched. Jon came to the steps and kissed Sansa on the brow and Edric on the head. The babe made an offended noise and then quieted, because you learn to trust in rooms like this. Gendry held out his hand, and Jon took it, and they looked at one another like men who had been boys within arm's reach of each other's histories and had survived to become something else. Take care of my sister, Jon said, because he had to say it even though he knew the man he said it to did not need telling. I will take care of our people, Gendry said, which is taking care of your sister. Arya stepped forward long enough to press something into Jon's hand. A small carved wolf that looked like it had been whittled out of a bit of driftwood from the Weeping Tower. For your pocket, she said, not to keep you safe because things don't, but to keep your hand busy while you think. He grinned. You'll come back in spring and laugh at us all. She grinned back with that savage little joy of hers. If there's anything left to laugh at. There were tears because there are always tears when men we love refuse to be owned and go anyway. Jon swung into the saddle. Ghost looked up at him, red eyes bright as coals. The gate opened, and the world beyond was white and quiet and vast, like a sheet left out on the line in a storm. He rode with 4 men at his back and the knowledge like a weight balanced right. He had made the choice. The North and the Stormlands would hold with him gone. A wolf and a stag had found a hearth and had set a child by it. Years are measured in harvests and graves. 3 years after Jon rode north, a fever took hold in the riverlands that made men stumble and sweat. The pact held. Grain flowed south where the crops were thin, and men who had never taken a northern road in their lives came under pines and saw the breath of their horses like ghosts and did not die. 5 years after, a storm that men named out of habit and fear as the Widow's Rage chewed the coast between Cape Wrath and Shipbreaker Bay until 2 villages dreamed of the sea for a decade after, waking with their bedclothes soaked in sweat. The pact held. Carpenters from White Harbor taught boys from Tarth how to brace beams, and girls from the Rainwood learned to sew sails in the cold light of northern dawns. The roads held. The ships held. The songs changed. Edric grew like a boy grows who is watched and loved and told no when he needs it. He threw temper like boys throw sticks, and he apologized the way sons of the North do with work. He had Sansa's patience and Gendry's hands, which meant tools fit in them easily and plans took in them without fear. He liked the gods would at Storm's End best in that hour before dawn when birds make small questions to each other. He liked the sound of flip of fish on the docks at White Harbor when his father took him north that first time and he got sick and then refused to get sick again out of stubborn pride. He laughed easily and judged slowly and believed that what was broken could be mended with time and a good pair of hands. Not because anyone told him so, but because he saw it in the way men he loved lived. Once, when he was 7, he asked why they did not have a crown like the boys in ballads did. Gendry said, "It would slip over my eyes and make me fall down staircases." And Sansa said, "It would cut your brow and you'd bleed into your soup." And Davos, who was visiting that week with a story about a whale that had come up the Mander the size of a tower and then turned out to be a man's lie that wished to be true, said, The only crowns worth having are the kind that make other people's lives better when you wear them. And Edric, who knew jokes and truths when they were set beside each other, said, "Then we have one," and put his head in his mother's lap and grinned up at his father until Gendry had to grin back. In the 9th winter of the Pact, a company of hard men with more scars than patience crossed the Blackwater from the Crownlands and took coin from a lordling with more title than sense to hire swords to ride to the Stormlands and make an example of that barrow-lord blacksmith who thinks to make peace with wolves. They came under cover of rain and thought stone would give way under them because so many things had. They found instead that habits hold where words might not. The fishermen whose boys had learned to lay planks at White Harbor sealed their doors and held them with hands that knew rope. The men on the walls who had married Tarth girls who could shoot as straight as their fathers had learned to call the wind when it bent arrows. Sansa walked the parapet with her cloak heavy and her hair plaited close, and Gendry in mail at her side looked like a king and did not call himself one and did not need to. When the Sel's words were taken by tide and arrow and their own tired hearts, the few captains left said between their teeth that they had been paid to take a fortress and had instead been given a town that had learned to be one thing. They went away. After, in the hall, Sansa said, "We will send a letter to this lordling with the longer name than sense and tell him that next time we will send him the bill for the arrows he bought with his folly." And the hall laughed deeply. In the 12th year, Jon came back, although he had never said he would. He arrived at Winterfell on a day with sun so bright the snow wore it like a jewel. He was thinner and his face was a map no man had drawn, only the wind and time, and Ghost's muzzle was gray the way old snow goes gray when it sees too many steps. He sat at their table and watched Edric tell a tale he had practiced of how he had thrown a stone at a fish and the fish had seemed to throw it back by the way the water leaped. Jon listened like a man who had learned again how to be warmed from the outside in. He told them about the ice that sings and a valley where the wind sounds like a crowd cheering and no one's there. He told them about a bear that had risen to its full height and stared at Ghost, and Ghost had stared at it. And after a long time both had snorted as if they had shared a joke no man needed to hear. He stayed a season. He stayed through one of Edric's birthdays and taught the boy to hold a sword with his hands soft so the blade wouldn't feel like a thing to strangle. He stayed through one of Sansa's feasts and watched her command a hall without raising her voice and thought of a girl he had once known who had been told to smile whether or not she felt like it and marveled at the woman who now smiled when she chose. He stayed through a storm at Storm's End and stood on the wall with Gendry and let the wind slap him until his ears rang, and then went inside and sat with Bran's letter on the table between them like a third cup. Said nothing of import. Said everything. Tormund sent a bit of carved bone from some beast he swore had had 6 legs and a grin. Arya sent a shell from beyond a place she refused to name. Ghost slept by the fire and dreamed of wolves and woke with a little huff of satisfaction. "You did it," Jon said, not looking at them because there are things you say like that, and if you look men will puff out their chests or flee. "You made a kind of peace you can live with." "We made it daily," Sansa said. "You make it again and again the way you need bread. You let it rest and you return to it. It rises if you tend it." "Sounds like a lot of work for a thing that just gets eaten," Gendry said, grinning, and Sansa gave him a look that said he was a fool and the kind she loved. When Jon left again, he left without the sense of being torn he had had the first time. Edric stood in the yard with the snow up to his ankles and promised to write letters that would take 2 seasons to arrive, and that he would lose interest in halfway through but send anyway because he had learned that men keep one another alive with such ridiculous things. Jon took his face between his hands and said, "If a man tells you he is not afraid, he wants something from you." And the boy nodded solemnly, feeling the weight of the words settle in him and knowing he would have to live into them long before he understood them. Sansa stood on the step with her hands folded into her sleeves and watched her brother go. Gendry came to stand beside her and they said nothing, because sometimes the best thing to say is nothing in unison. So it was that the North and the Stormlands learned to live as neighbors with a shared wall, built of oaths and habit and the daily work of women and men who do not think themselves heroic. They learned to count their coin differently, in loaves and windows mended and men who came home. A generation came up that thought of Storm's End as a place where winter stories get told in rooms that smell of salt and wood smoke, and Winterfell as a place where one can hear the sea if someone from the south has just come in from the road and is still carrying it in the wet hem of his cloak. There were funerals. There were births. There were lean years and busy ones. There was love enough to keep a hearth stoked. There was envy abroad and plotting, but it ran up against a habit like a wall. There were songs made and forgotten and made again. There were boys who took their first sword in hand at 16 and then decided to learn carpentry instead because they had seen a hall raised in a week out of hands and wood and it had taken their breath away. When Sansa and Gendry were older and the gray in his hair was a part of him and not a surprise, and her hands had that fine translucence that comes to those who have held more than they have dropped, they stood on the rampart at Storm's End at dusk. The sea looked like hammered metal. She wore the brooch he had made, though the tin had darkened to a color that sometimes did not hold the light. He wore a ring she had commissioned that had the smallest traced line of a direwolf in it, no more than a whisper of a shape and perfectly done. "Do you ever think about the kind of crowns we didn't pick?" he asked, leaning where the wind pushed and made your body its own kind of mast. "Yes," she said. "When it rains, I think about gold wearing thin and the water hiding where it can and making everything rot. When it snows, I think about iron freezing a man's brow. And then I think about your hand on my back when I was tired, and Edric laughing when he thought no one was listening, and the smell of bread in White Harbor when we walked its docks last year, and I decide we picked the right ones." He smiled and put his hand at her back, where it fit as it had from the first weeks, and they looked out at a world they'd helped forge with no bellies of dragons turning it to ash beneath their toes, only the old enemies. Winter, hunger, pride. Those, at least, you could meet at your door with men and women enough to push them back a step and then another. On a night years after, Edric stood in Winterfell's godswood as the heart tree whispered again with a wind that had crossed snow and ocean and fields and streets and rooms, carrying 1,000 small stories like dry leaves. He had a child whose hair looked like dusk when it fell into her eyes and whose hands had reached out at birth and grabbed as if the world were a rope she meant to climb. He spoke to the tree the way his father had, telling it little things it had no need to hear but holding them out anyway. The weight of his daughter when she slept, the way his wife's laugh changed when she teased him, the way the sea had looked the last time he'd stood on the wall at Storm's End and a storm had failed to frighten him and he'd been a little disappointed. He spoke his own oath, old words repaired by use, that the North would keep faith with the Stormlands, not because dead men said so or living ones demanded it, but because it made people's lives better when they did. He laid his palm to the bark, which was cold and slick with frost, and swore it there. Beyond the wall, a man with a beard the color of storm clouds and eyes like he'd seen something the rest of them hadn't yet sat in a cave and listened to the ice sing. Beside him, a great white wolf slept and snored like a bellows. The song was very old. It went on, variation on theme, repeating, mending itself, never ending. In the city by the Blackwater, where men wear crowns and talk themselves into thinking they are taller for it, a council changed and then changed again, and a king wrote letters no one read twice. In Dorne, a woman with a gift for making gardens where there had been only dust sent seeds north that could stand a touch of frost and still bloom. In the Vale, boys who had never wanted to be knighted learned to read numbers because numbers build roads. In the Riverlands, a wheelwright taught his daughter how to listen to wood and make it sing under weight. In Bear Island, a Mormont of uncertain temper and certain aim taught Stormlanders to throw spears without looking like fools. Men and women grew old and learned what had always been true. Oaths keep men only so much as men keep oaths. The rest is work and bread and the honest pride of seeing something you made stand up in weather. And if, sometimes on a night when the fire burns low and the people you owe everything to are sleeping and the house hums like a great living thing around you, you hear in the wind the names of those you loved who left before, well, there is no oath to bind them to your hearth. They come when they come, go when they go. You live, you love, you make things strong enough for a winter, and then you hand them off. In the morning, the light found every nail head and made it flash. The ships rocked in their harbors, as honest as hammers. The road between White Harbor and the Neck kept its shape through ruts and rain. Wolves hunted in the forests and went to ground in the lean times and found each other again in the fat. The kings and songs died and were born. The people under their feet kept moving forward. Sansa and Gendry stood in the doorway of Storm's End's hall one more time and watched men come in for soup with their hats in their hands and their eyes steady. He leaned into her the way he always had, trusting her weight against his as surely as he trusted steel. She pressed her hand to his and did not need to look to know where it was. "Do you ever think," he said soft, "that we were just two people who got very lucky with our stubbornness?" "All the time," she said, smiling against the stiff salt of the air. "And then I think, stubbornness isn't luck. It's a tool." He laughed, the low sound of a man with a good fire at his back and a storm he had learned to respect, not fear, at his door. They stepped inside, where the work waited, as it always does, and where men and women shaped their days, as they always have. Outside, the waves kept time against the old stones, and the wind carried a thin scarf of snow across the ground where someone had planted a little reach of young trees that would not be great for 100 years yet and planted them anyway.